Welcome to SIR Studios Inside the Issue. Today's guest is Vincent Czyz, whose story Pub Blues is featured in the spring 2025 issue of Southern Indiana Review. Vincent Czyz is the author of 2 novels, a short story collection, an essay collection, a novella, and a forthcoming collection of short fiction, which will be out in September of this year. He is the recipient of 2 fiction fellowships from the New Jersey Council of the Arts, the William Faulkner-William Wisdom Prize for short fiction, Eric Hoffer Award for Best in Small Press, and the Truman Capote Fellowship at Rutgers University. His stories have appeared in Shenandoah, the Massachusetts Review, Tin House, Copper Nickel, and Tampa Review, among other places. Vince, welcome inside the issue.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate taking the time. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe read a little bit of your story, Pub Blues, for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll start at the beginning.
Great.
Passaic was ugly, uglier in the rain. Gladys sighed. That was Jersey. Although the lobby's tall windows were hidden by dusty curtains, she could see the street through the glass door. Tires made wet sounds as cars zipped past. Main Avenue's asphalt was potholed, patched, in need of repaving. The rain wouldn't make the city any cleaner. Passaic had a river, but you'd never know it. No restaurants or cafes overlooking the water, just muddy banks, trash, and old tires, like black, oversized donuts nothing can digest. Gladys had read that in the op-ed section in this morning's paper. She'd worked at the Passaic Evening News for more than 20 years. Same desk in the lobby, everything neatly arranged on it. Her chair might have been the only thing replaced in 2 decades. No, the original curtains were gone too. The building was a rectangular box with 2 floors. Pollution had tarnished its yellow bricks the color of a sponge that needed to be thrown out. The newsroom was downstairs, to her right when she was at her desk. Upstairs were marketing, circulation, and sports. It was a dead afternoon. The phone hadn't even rung in 10 or 15 minutes. Fat drops formed on the telephone wires across the street, then fell. Parked cars had taken on shimmering second skins. She recognized Vasilis as soon as she glimpsed him through the door. It was the gray overcoat, a double-breasted relic of some army or other, and the Greek fisherman's cap. He was the features writer. He usually profiled local artists and community organizations, but sometimes he reviewed a book or a movie. He'd written this morning's editorial about the wasted potential of Passaic's waterfront. Vasilis pushed through the clear door. Gladys, you're still here. An auspicious omen. Water glistened like powdered glass on the shoulders of his coat. I work here, Vasily. For like 20 years? He took off his hat. People leave all the time. I've got resumes out myself. Do you? For a second, her face felt pinched, as though someone had given it a quick squeeze between thumb and fingers. It's 1996. Who can survive on a salary from 1976? He winked. I've got plans. Washington Post. Maybe the New York Times. The Village Voice is my safety valve. See you later. He turned toward the newsroom. Vasily. He stopped, eyebrows raised, chin lifted. Is the other door bad luck or something? Until about a month ago, he'd used the employees' entrance, like everyone else, on the other side of the building, next to the parking lot. Sometimes I walk to work. But you came up Main Avenue from that way, she pointed toward the parking lot. When you walk, you come from the other direction. You keeping files on us back there? I noticed things, especially when she was bored. He glanced around. Well, it's not because I forgot what the lobby looks like. He turned and walked away, the hem of his glistening coat sweeping out, scooping up air, and bringing it with him into the newsroom. She watched his back retreat. Her cheeks were hot. Vasily's voice rang in hellos to the copy editors at their desks. The phone startled her, and she reached for it.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
So I'm curious. where this story, like the genesis of the story, where it came from, or what incited it, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it has multiple origins. To start with, I used to work at the North Jersey Herald and News, which was located at 988 Main Avenue in Passaic, New Jersey.
Okay.
I was the features writer, and occasionally I did, art reviews, book reviews. So I have that in common with Vasily. Um, but also, I lived in Turkey for 7 years. I'm really about 8 years. So I learned a good deal of Turkish history, and I learned a certain amount of Greek history because those two histories are intertwined for about 500 years. And Gladys, mostly someone I imagined. She's not anyone I ever met. She's not anyone who I worked with in the newsroom. I never knew any of the receptionists when I worked at the Herald News. But somehow, all these elements came together and started to form a story in my head. And usually, what I do when I write, as soon as I feel something that needs to be written, I start writing it. And I don't use outlines. I just follow where the writing goes, and the story takes shape on the page, essentially.
Um, so how to like so the process of bringing Vasily and Gladys together, is that just that process of creating this character, creating these two characters, and I don't know, like Andre Debuse says, create the character, follow the dots, something will happen, kind of thing. Whereas it just putting these two characters on the page and like sort of witnessing them and witnessing their crossing paths and following it essentially. Then
Well, Gladys came first.
Gladys
I
came first. Okay.
Yeah, Gladys came first. I wanted to write a character, a middle-aged woman who was not unhappy, but something's missing in her life. And if she thought about it, she could probably figure it out without much trouble. But her life is um, routines that keep her from thinking about too much or thinking, self-reflecting too much. Uh, Even her course on, medieval history, that's just another outlet. And it deflects from introspection. So I knew I wanted her first. The medieval thing, there's a certain sterility in medieval society. And that's kind of paralleled in her life. You know, Vasily has that quip about Middle Ages, chastity belts, all those arranged marriages. He gets it right away.
Mhm.
She doesn't see that part. She says, "Oh, but the art is beautiful," and she's interested in what happens after empires collapse, which is a tenuous connection to Vasily himself, whose life and family are actually affected, strongly affected by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They
Mhm.
wind up moving to America.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about Gladys, because I think, so many people are like her, right? Where
Yes,
I mean, I think
yes,
we surround, we being, writers and uh sort of it's our job to sort of think deeply and to imagine. And we forget, I think, that a lot of people are just they don't think about the things that we think about, right? Or we don't they're not very introspective, or even all that self-aware. And I think that's a it's really interesting to consider a character like that, and to try to grant her the dignity of her life, right? Like she's the story. One of the things I think story does so well is it doesn't judge her for her infidelity, right?
no,
So it just allows her to be who she is. And if a reader wants to judge her, that's of course the reader's
that's going to happen.
right. But I think that it, the story just, allows her to be a human, right? And allows her
Exactly, yeah.
to make what many people might consider a mistake, but without judgment. She's somebody who's making decisions, and we're witnessing what she's doing. Um, So is that process you mentioned for you that it's just kind of like, immediately writing the thing, whatever the thing is that gets your attention. So once you have the story though, or you have what seems to be taking shape as a story, um, how does that process look for you? Maybe I'm asking sort of about revision here, I guess, but more so that space, that time where you are like, okay, I do have something here, right? You're, I can imagine it being, a half a dozen pages into this paper. You're like, oh, okay, I think I've got some trouble. I've got these two characters. I've got, what happens at that stage for you then?
Yeah, what I do is I write the story, and when I sit down again the next day, I read what I wrote previously,
Mhm.
and then I go from there. And, for me, these stories are an accretion. They really are. As I said, I don't use an outline. I sometimes think ahead to the ending, and I did do that with this novel, and I originally had a different ending. I don't think it was a terrible ending, but I think the ending it has now is better. And it said what I wanted to say without actually saying it. I mean that's the that's the gosh, what's the word I want? The optimum, you know, if you can say it without actually coming out and saying it, and you can do it with an image, that's the best way to do it. So, but as I write, a lot of times scenes present themselves. It's just I'm writing and it comes to me. Sometimes characters take off on their own a little bit, and that's always a good thing. I mean, that means your unconscious is involved, and it means the story is taking its own direction. It's not being too artificially molded. It's not being too much crafted, which is something I saw a lot in graduate school. And I didn't go to graduate school until I was um, quite a bit older than most of the students. So I was already well formed as a writer, and I could just ignore things that, bothered me or I didn't wasn't interested in. But I saw a lot of them trying to conform. And I taught undergrads for 5 years at the College of New Jersey, and I got my MFA. And I can tell you that the undergrads have more originality and vision than the grad students. They wind up trying to please somebody. I'm not sure who, but that's what seems to wind up happening. And I don't really have that issue. I let the story, it doesn't write itself. I wish it did. That's not how it works. But I follow the story. I don't push and I don't try to squeeze it into a mold.
Yeah, that I think you speaking of undergrads, that's what I teach, and I think what you said tracks. They often don't have the technical skill yet to pull off
Yes.
the
Yes.
their vision, but they do tend to have vision. They do tend to take big swings at things, and
Exactly.
they
Yeah.
don't play it as safe. I'm going to come back to the final image, the ending of this story in a minute. But
Sure.
did this story? Do you remember it posing any particular challenges to you, whether when you were drafting it or when you returned to it to revise?
Yeah, sure. I was imagining a middle-aged woman, and this was written in 2013, and I was not a middle-aged man at that time. And so that was a real challenge for me to make her an authentic middle-aged woman. And I have, a couple of readers. I think these days they're called beta readers. And one of my readers is a woman somewhat younger than I am. And at one point, I had Gladys go shopping, and she blasted me for this. She's like, "Oh, typical woman. She's going shopping," and it wasn't so much a cliche, but you know, my wife loves to shop, and I just fell into the easy, base her on my wife thing.
Mhm.
And then I realized my reader was right. You know, she's not going to go shopping. She's going to do something else, and instead, she takes up her time with that class on medieval history. Instead of a shopping spree, it's going to the class was there, but I took up that particular scene with, going to class.
I mean, I think the story, um, yeah, I think we're in a kind of particular time, I think, where we're understandably so very sensitive about writing, appropriating a different sort of person's story. And not this story isn't doing that at all, but it's very, I think that's kind of in the air, and I think rightfully so. But I think this story does a really nice job of you know, Gladys felt authentic. Now, I mean, I'm not a middle-aged woman, so I can't speak with a whole lot of authority on that. But there was never a moment in the story where I questioned a move where I'm like, that doesn't feel right, given her age and her gender. So yeah, I mean, I think you pulled that off nicely. So I'm interested in the ending. You said there was a different ending than what we have here,
Yeah,
and I think the ending. I agree with you. The ending. Well, I guess I shouldn't say. I don't know what the other ending was, so I can't say this one was
right.
better. But this ending, it really you really stick the landing in this ending. Where we have Gladys dancing with her husband Fred, and which is kind of a surprise because he's not the kind of man who would typically get up and dance with her, and he does. Um, and they're dancing, and the Macarena comes on, which is a perfect sort of like time capsule kind of thing. And they're dancing, and we have this echo from before when she was at the Pub Blues dancing with Vasily. So the story, the narrative is she wanted him to be glad he had married her. She also wanted him to snake an arm around her waist and press up against her, which is that echo from before. She
Exactly.
she wanted to dance chest to back just for half a minute, the way she saw younger people dance sometimes. She tilted her head up slightly and let her body translate the music. The alcohol made her head feel cavernous and echoing. And then we get the real sort of gut punch ending is she's dancing and she turns around and Fred's gone. She's been dancing by herself this entire time. And I think that, you know, that's the kind of ending where um, you know, so we get, editors get lots of good stories, right?
Of
Lots of
course.
stories that are, even better than good, but it's the moments like this, you're like, that's what we're after, right? That moment where this is a moment for me in a story where, and I mean, regardless of how it came about, this is where I read a story like this, I'm like, this writer knows what he's doing. And I'm looking for those moments where, I'm both, of course, surprised by what happens, but then, of course, also like, no, that's exactly how it has to end, right? Um, so maybe just talk about how you arrived at this particular final image.
Absolutely. The original ending had more to do with Vasily and her. And I realized that the story would be stronger and the ending would be stronger if it was a comment on Gladys and her husband. You know, because that's the mainstay. Vasily is intruding into their marriage. And there's a double irony here. And one is distant and just vaguely implied. It's not really there. But the truth is, even if Fred had found out she was cheating on him, he wouldn't have really cared. He was beyond that at that point. He wasn't really interested in her as, you know, an object of passion anymore. It wouldn't have been a big deal. And the more direct irony, which I think you got, is that one of the biggest reasons she breaks up with Vasily is she says, "What if you leave me? This isn't tried and true and tested. What if you leave me? I spend my last years alone." And what she realizes at the very end is that she's been alone for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, they both are, right? Her and Fred are both sort of alone. like, I mean,
Yeah.
together, but they're,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Alone together.
Um, yeah. And that is, it speaks to sort of what we were talking before about, people who maybe don't lead. And I guess I should qualify this. I think it's probably a privilege to lead an examined life, right? Some people are like I think it's a privileged position, but this idea that she isn't unhappy, but she's not, you know, uh the passion is gone. She's not in love anymore, but she's worried about she goes with what's safe, right? Which is what she
Yeah.
knows, which is I think what many people go through life, right? They take the path that's safe and easy and solid. And that's admirable too. That's what I think is sort of great about this is that I think I can empathize with her too, and be like, well, yeah, that I can see why she would choose Fred because Fred is steady, and I can see why she
It's
wouldn't.
not just that. She was never all that in love with Fred. She got pregnant.
That's right. That's
They
right.
had to get married.
That's right.
So essentially, again, this is the, I hope, a subtle reflection of the arranged marriages in the medieval
Yep.
history
Yep.
she
Yep.
studied. There was never that passion. It was essentially an arranged marriage.
That's right.
She didn't want to do it. They just decided, well, a child needs two parents. So they decided to make it work. It was not a marriage of passion and, deep love. It wasn't quite convenience, but
Mhm.
it was out of the rational mind. It wasn't out of it wasn't from the heart.
Yeah, and but I don't know. I guess there's still something to be respected about that too, right? It's not,
There is.
and I mean,
Exactly, again.
that's
Yes.
what I think is so cool about this character is because she probably makes the right choice,
In the
right?
eyes of society.
And
This
and,
is,
and you sure in
this
the
is the question of
yeah,
sacrificing self,
yeah,
which is what everyone in medieval times was expected to do.
yeah.
You your marriage is arranged, it's sanctified by the church, and you're expected to fulfill your social and religious duties. It's all about duty. That was all going to change when romantic love came along, and people were going to say, throw duty overboard, throw these social expectations overboard. There's something more important.
Hmm.
And she gives up. She has it. It's in her hands.
Yeah.
Celia is willing to stay with her, and she gives it up again because she maybe she doesn't quite have the courage. Maybe she's afraid of being alone. She's
Mhm.
afraid it won't work out. She can't make the leap. And then, it leads where it leads.
Yeah, no, that's what you were talking about before, like tying into the medieval stuff. That's actually the it ties sort of subtextually ties even more so with that idea. Um, yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I think ultimately the choice you made to center us back on Gladys and Fred is the right choice. I mean, because at the very on the last section of the story, it's a year after, so it's
Yeah,
she hasn't seen him.
yeah.
She's read some of his pieces in the paper, but has sort of cut things off. Yeah, I don't know. I think that was the right choice to bring us back. When you wrote that final image or the final image in the story, did you have that feeling of like, yeah, that's the right one?
I did. I
Yeah.
did. I once um I thought of this one to replace the other one, which hadn't been written yet. I mean, I knew what it was. They were both in my head. But of the two, I chose this one and I didn't look back. I was like, no, this is the way the story ends. I understood it very clearly.
Yeah, and I think too the language is just I mean it doesn't draw attention to itself, but it's subtle and nice, and it does what you were talking about before about you know it's implication and suggestion rather than the image is doing what doing carrying all the weight, doing all the heavy lifting for you.
Well, it's good to hear. That was definitely the intention.
But yeah, well, I mean, and that's what I was saying too before about like when I got to the ending of the story, um, you know, it felt it felt right, and it felt. I know you talked before about not thinking in terms of like stories being crafted, but I don't. I guess I don't mean in the same way you were talking about it. But here, that was that moment where I was like, yeah, that's this person, this writer knows what he's doing. Um, even if it was operating on instinct, it's that
Right.
it's that feeling where I'm always sort of looking for, and I think every reader is, where, or at least probably reader who writes, especially, where you can just turn everything off and read the story, right? You know that questioning part, or like, well, I would have done this, or why didn't the scene do this, when the story doesn't allow any of those questions to occur. And I think that the story does that, particularly that ending. Just like I said, it really landed for me. Um, so shifting gears a little bit, what were some writers or books that were important to you early on?
Oh, let's see. Well, the first book that just blew me away was Samuel R. Delany's Dog Run. It's touted as science fiction, but it's not. You know, he and I have talked about this, and he calls it North American magical realism, and I dispute that for the simple reason that when completely miraculous things happen in that book, people are blown away by it. They're like, this can't happen. And that's not what happens in magical realism. They take it as for granted. So for me, it's species of speculative fiction. But it was a book that was for me a paradigm shift. I saw this, really imaginative landscape, and at the same time, this incredibly detailed, granular um, setting, lots of poetic descriptions of an imagined city. It's just um, really drew me in and affected me deeply. And that was the first one. And I thought, yes, I would like to be able to write like this. Um, and originally, I didn't write short stories. I started off going right for a novel. That was the first thing I wrote. Short stories came later.
Hmm.
Then I found, in terms of short story, I fell in love with Raymond Carver for a while, and I still like Carver. Borges, I adore Borges. John Edgar Wideman, and these are all, as I think you know, completely different writers.
Yeah.
It's hard to be more disparate than these three individuals. I love Alice Munro, um, Jane Ann Phillips. Black Tickets was a big one for me.
Yeah.
Um, I just thought she has done so much with the short story form. She goes from Alice Munro like conventional piece to something that looks like nothing else I've read before, and just surviving on the power of its imagery and the power of its language. And she could just move between those different modes so easily. And I really admired that. But Guy Davenport came later. Guy Davenport and his short stories, just amazing in their crystalline quality of language and of perception. He's a thing unto himself. Um, William Gass as a novelist, the language again just blew me away. Paul West as a novelist became he was something of a mentor for a while. Um, I love Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, maybe the most cleanly written novel ever, one of them certainly, in terms of just no bad sentences, nothing that makes you roll your eyes. And then Dennis Johnson. I wasn't so taken with his short story collection, which everybody loves. What is it? Something about Jesus.
Yeah.
You know the one I'm talking about.
Yeah. Jesus the Son. Yeah.
Yes, Jesus' son. I wasn't so taken with that. But Angels, his first novel,
Hmm.
I believe his first book, it's hard to find a better novel. It really is hard. Everything is done from sentences to characters to plots. It's hard to find anything better than that as a novel. There are longer ones out there, you know, but he really did everything you need to do.
Um, I think isn't it's been too long. I've read Angels, but it's been too long. I think the the main character in Jesus' Son, I think doesn't he appear? I think he's like a side character in Angels.
He may have been, yeah.
Think so.
I read Angels fairly recently. I read Jesus' Son when it came out, so a long time ago.
Yeah. Um, so what about any writers? I mean, obviously these are ones that you're, continue to go back to, but any writers that we should be reading on top of the ones you've mentioned, or any new writers or writing
Yeah,
now?
I have some contemporaries I really admire, and one is Tamás Dobozy. He's a Hungarian Canadian author, and he's just absolutely one of my favorite contemporary authors. Milkweed put out a book of his called Siege 13. It won a big prize, probably the equivalent of the Penn Faulkner in Canada. And he's not very well known. And to me, it's shameful because he's really good. And and again, he's someone who's extremely imaginative, a real craftsman when it comes to stories, but also wonderful language, beautiful sentences, and again, no bad ones. I'm so envious of these guys who put together, men and women, these authors who put together, a whole book of fiction and no eye rollers, no, embarrassing sentences. This is something I really, really admire. He's one. Stephanie Dickinson, a wonderful stylist. She writes novels and short stories, and her novels, they always experiment with form. They tend to be fragmentary. Um, but again, someone who I mentioned Stephanie Dickinson, and people are like, who? But she's so good.
Familiar with her?
She's really so good. I've reviewed two of her books. The last one I reviewed was called Black Swan, Blue Swan, and it's imagining the life of George Trakl, the poet, the German poet. And she really gets Trakl-esque language down to write that. It's beautifully done. It's beautifully accomplished. So those are a couple of my contemporaries I really like. If I sat down and thought about it, I'm sure I could dig up a few more.
Sure.
Um,
So what are you currently working on? You mentioned or in your bio you mentioned a forthcoming collection. Um,
yeah, yeah. The short story collection is called Old Man Evil. That's the title of the lead story. Sorry, the flagship story. The first story in the collection is actually Pub Blues. And just as a by the way, Pub Blues was a real pub.
oh,
And it really was in Newark, New Jersey. And it really was set up for Spanish and Portuguese. There's a whole section of Newark called the Ironbound section, which is mostly Brazilian, Portuguese, and Spanish. So that was a real place. And I went there several times and had a great time. Um, I just want to, most of the things in that story have some kind of biographical reference for me. I was in that village, Carmilasos, but it was with my wife, who's Turkish, as it happens. And one of the things that influenced this story is that we saw this stone staircase, and it's a ghost village now, as I write in the story. It's this really haunting ghost village. you feel some kind of presence there. The Greeks said they cursed it, and the Albanians refused to move in when the Turks tried to move in new people. They're like, no, we're not doing it. And my wife, whose name is Neslihan, we were standing at the bottom of that staircase, and she started crying. And I said, what's the matter? She said, I can imagine these people looking back for the last time and leaving their homes. She said, I see them coming down the staircase. It was almost, my wife is an engineer, an environmental engineer by training, but this was a really visceral response she had. And this figured strongly in the story as, from reading it. So, just to backtrack a little, these are some of the roots of the story. I wanted to find a way to put them all together in the story.
That's actually really, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I talk, I try to talk to students about this, that, most stories are not autobiographical, but they are made up of pieces of our lives.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And it's just,
exactly.
we're pulling things, or, we have an observation or a memory, and, we, so that it's, to try to get them to sort of have their antenna up all the time, like to pay attention,
Exactly.
notice, because you never know when that thing might be quite literally the missing piece to your story, or some detail to give, to round out a character, or I don't know. It's just, that's really cool to hear you say that this story is made up of these little small pieces of real history for you, in a story
And they connect up
yeah.
because, that bar, Pub Blues, Rebettica is essentially Greek blues. And, there's the larger sadness within societies, especially the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, but also their own, Gladys and Vasili's story is is on the smaller scale a species of blues. So I wanted those things to reflect back one another.
Yeah, that's very cool. And the collection's coming out in September, is that correct?
September. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll have to make sure everybody keeps an eye out for that, definitely. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was great to hear about Pub Blues, and more in depth, and where it came from. You guys can find Pub Blues in the spring 2025 issue of SIR. You can go to usi.edu/SIR to find out how to get a copy. The link will be in the description, as will Vince's bio. Thanks so much, Vince, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
It was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll see everybody on the next one.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Pycior.